Hi folks, Donna Bob here. We're back in the Sauriarium today, and we're going to be working on, well, I've been working on a habitat for a couple of dinosaurs. The park had originally started trying to build it out as if it actually did have a budget, although it was built in sandbox. And so I was starting with smaller animals. This habitat is going to be the first jump from that. Because we're doing the Kaiparowits dinosaurs, and I would have started this originally as a Pseudoceratops habitat alone, but Parasaurolophus is going right in here before we finish today. So I started by laying out the swamp that these animals would inhabit, doing the water and getting a sense of it. Started laying in the major trees to give me a sense of how much was necessary, and then checking in on the Pseudoceratops periodically to see if it was happy with the amount of foliage that it was getting in its habitat. And it just kept wanting more and more and more. It's a very large habitat, again, built before the devs cut down on the requirements. So after putting in stuff with the brush for a lot of the under stuff, I needed to go back in and do adjustments because things were, in the middle of water or not aesthetically grouped, and so a lot of time was spent tweaking all of these things that came out of the brush. Often also to do things like hide one of the dung beetle nests, or at least obscure it enough that it wasn't all that obvious. And the next step was going in to put rocks in, both as a barrier and a visual screen along the outsides of the habitat, as well as putting in some to break up the looks of the habitat. You can see the bridge there, which is a subsidiary viewpoint into the habitat. It's going to an area of the park that hasn't been developed yet. And opposite it in this habitat, there is a platform with a tree in the center of it. But right now I'm checking, seeing how it all looks. And you can see the building there. You may have noticed it in some of the earlier Sauriarium books. I subsequently decided that that didn't fit the way the aesthetic of the park was going. So it went away, and we're getting a speed build now of replacing it. I started with laying in the stairway to get people to the upper deck of this viewing area, because I intended to have a ground level and an upper deck. And it seemed to me to be most important to make sure the guest paths were in place. You can see me doing things like changing to a rounded aesthetic as opposed to the squared off aesthetic for the landings between the levels of the staircase, and also on the ends of the upper deck. A brief excursion to cut out the rain. I spent a lot of this build, as you can see, building it while the plants were in place, and I do finally get around to taking them out of my way in order to be able to see what I'm building more clearly. You're going to be seeing a couple of jumps, experimenting here with still having a speed build, but not running the whole thing, because this was a pretty complicated build. It took me quite a while to do this building and to make up this habitat, in part because of its size, and it would have overrun the 15 minutes that YouTube would prefer me to stay within. So sort of highlights version, rather than seeing every little wall go in or what have you. I'm putting in a tile roof at this point here. That's the sort of the starter to give me a idea of how it looked against the walls. I ultimately decided, much like those conical sections of the roof on the stairwell, that that wasn't the answer, at least not in that color. And at the end, you'll see the change there. So I decided to put a glass top to the top of the stairwell, in part to let light in, and in part to just have a different vibe to a portion of this build. And I also ended up, once I got them in place, basically duplicating them a couple of times so that they seemed more solar protective glass, and to cut down the heat absorption in that stairwell so that our guests would be more comfortable. Obviously, it has no effect in the game, just trying to think a little bit about how the building might actually be designed. You can see I'm mostly leaving the roof off, and that is so I have a little bit easier access to doing some of the interior details. I didn't follow my own rule deep into the build and ended up having to struggle through walls and within the confines to do some of the final detailing. But you'll be spared a fair bit of that time. I wanted to have an elevator up to the upper platform for handicapped guests. So I grabbed one of my elevator door bills and started setting it up so that it could theoretically take our handicapped guests up there. And obviously the sign for them that needed a darker background to make it stand out. And that'll also get adjusted later in. Decided I wanted to have some connector to the ground, even though adobe buildings often are directly in contact with the ground. It just seemed like it might be a good thing because I was planning on covering up the platforms and floors inside the building, at least on the edges, because I didn't like the concrete blocks look of those green stripes, but I did like the green stripes and wanted to give a little more contrast and make the build a little livelier because of that. Put in view screens, of course, because we need to keep our guests educated, or we will. And putting them on the curve there meant fussing with them a lot. The section you see me work on right now was a lot of wasted work in the final build for a couple of reasons. But I was struggling with how getting light into the stairwell while also working with the side of the building that was on the habitat side and having it look okay. But I eventually decided that this building was just too tall. Although it gave a great overview for the park, it was just too tall. So you will shortly be getting a jump and see what I did there. So I needed to fix the paths coming around the building, and that meant moving some landscape and starting to address some landscaping right up in front of the building here. It'll get adjusted even further later. And there's the jump. So I wanted to put a small shelter area off to one side and connect it to the building. It's a separate group from the building itself, as you saw when it lit up on my selecting it, and started playing with the roof to see if it would blend okay with the building wall shapes and also with the other building. So I did have to mess around with that a little bit. I still haven't made the change to the color on the roofs, but you can see there are roofs in the main building, and I still haven't even finished the interior in there yet. Also in the shelter building. So I had to spend time selecting all those roofs to change their color, and as I mentioned before, working within them. So pretty perfunctory interior for this shelter. I wanted to be able to set the barriers up so it would function as a habitat, and needed to have something set up there so that the null barrier that I will be using for this area would have a barrier for the animals and keep them from wandering out or just deciding they're not actually in a habitat. which is a bit of an issue sometimes on these bills.
And so a little bit more cleanup, both with plants impinging on the building and a problem with the terrain not flattening properly. And then I need to do a door on the outside, so I grabbed one of my modular prefabs to do that. But naturally, it needed to be modified. So that's what I'm doing here. And trying to get it to a height more suitable for the animals in here, as opposed to the really tall door that was there. And then replacing the placeholder walls. And then moving one of the controls to where the keepers would get at it. And making some adjustments to make that look a little more plausible. So we are headed toward the end of this. If you've been enjoying watching my stuff, subscribe, like the videos, please, and make a comment, even if it's just to say you could have done this better. And Lord knows there's lots of things I could do better. But I don't necessarily know what other people are seeing. So we're going to cut to the outside now with a mostly finished building, and I put some signage in for the Kaiparowits corral. And you can see using the dinosaur silhouettes sort of pointing in different directions there to direct the guests either to the stairway for the upper deck or to the ground level viewing area. And we're going to go around the building, both inside and outside the habitat. You can see the roof color has changed, much closer to the trim color that I put in. And trims for the arches as well, which didn't exist before. I messed some more with this even after I videoed it. So this large blank wall it's got some ivy on it now. Not in this video though. And coming around, and a brief glimpse of two of the animals there. We've got some video of the animals in the habitat doing their animal things. And I don't know if you could see it when we spun around there, but there is an amenities stand inside the ground level viewing platform. So the Parasaurolophus is not a beginner animal, since it's a 5-star animal, and thus normally wouldn't go as early into this park as the other animals are. But since it got converted to a solid sandbox for me in one of the iterations of the bills, they're here. So this habitat is sort of finished all at once for its inhabitants. And that's pretty much that. I think next time it'll either be a brandy new animal or possibly an animal we've seen before. We'll see. I do have another habitat build in progress here. You may have caught a glimpse of it near the beginning of the video, and it needs to be finished out. Yeah, so I do have plans for this park. Plan on going further with it. And Lost Kingdom also has plans. Some of it's kind of dependent on upcoming updates, at least in terms of what I would prefer to do next. We're all still hanging out here. By the time you see this, you probably are not hanging out for the next update. Anyway, in any case, be well, be kind to each other, and I hope to see you in another video. Until such time, this is Dino Bob signing off.